He thought it was the end for him, until a miracle proved that hope was still alive. The air was thick with smoke, the kind that clogs your lungs and blinds your eyes. Somewhere in the distance, the echo of an explosion still reverberated, bouncing around the collapsing walls of the warehouse. Every breath I took felt like swallowing shards of glass, but I forced myself to keep inhaling. The alternative wasn't an option. Not yet anyway. Pinned beneath a chunk of steel that felt heavier than all my regrets combined, I barely managed to tilt my head to look around. The scene was chaos, fires raging, the warped remains of storage racks scattered across the concrete floor, and what little light remained casting eerie, flickering shadows. My body was screaming. My ribs felt like they had caved in, my legs were completely numb, and blood was pooling underneath me, sticky and warm. "Not like this," I whispered, though the words were more from me than anyone else. There wasn't anyone left to hear me. After all, it had all gone wrong so quickly. 1 minute, I was taking a risk, trying to negotiate my way out of the mess I'd created for myself. The next, the world turned upside down in a blast of heat and sound that knocked the air out of me. The explosion wasn't meant for me, or maybe it was. At this point, did it even matter? The weight of the steel pressing into my chest made it harder to think straight. My mind felt sluggish, like an old machine struggling to turn its gears. Memories began to bleed through, uninvited. Faces I hadn't seen in years, moments I'd spent decades trying to bury. They all came rushing back, swirling like a storm in my brain. I thought about my mom, the way she used to hum when she cooked dinner. I thought about my brother, the way he laughed, loud and carefree, back when we were kids and didn't know better. Most of all, I thought about all the chances I'd had to turn my life around and how I'd thrown every single one of them away. Is this what it feels like to die? The thought wasn't as frightening as it should have been. It felt almost peaceful in a way, like a wave pulling me under after a long, exhausting swim. I wanted to give in, to let go of the pain and the fear and the suffocating guilt that had been eating me alive for years. But something held me back, a tiny, stubborn flicker of resistance buried deep in my chest. It was faint, barely there, but it was enough to make me cling to the thin thread of consciousness I had left. As the seconds dragged on, I became acutely aware of how quiet it was. The explosions had stopped, the gunfire silenced, and the shouting voices that had filled the air were now just echoes in my head. The only sound left was the faint, uneven rhythm of my breathing, and even that was starting to fade. For a moment, I closed my eyes, letting the darkness creep in around the edges of my vision. Maybe it would be easier if I just let it happen. Let the weight of the steel and the smoke-filled air do their job. After all, wasn't this what I deserved? I'd spent years running. From people, from my mistakes, from myself. Maybe it was time to stop. But then something cut through the haze, a sound. Soft at first, almost too faint to notice. A hum. It was strange, melodic, out of place amidst the wreckage and destruction. I couldn't quite place it, but it reminded me of something familiar, something I couldn't quite name. I opened my eyes, blinking against the smoke and ash that still hung in the air. That's when I saw it, a faint glimmer of light, far too steady and bright to be coming from the fires around me. It wasn't natural, but it wasn't frightening either. If anything, it felt comforting. "Hey!" The voice was sharp, cutting through the fog in my mind like a blade. I tried to turn my head, but the weight pressing down on me made it impossible to move. Instead, I focused on the source of the sound, squinting through the smoke until a figure began to take shape. At first, I thought I was hallucinating. It wouldn't have been surprising, given how much blood I'd lost and how close I was to passing out. But as the figure moved closer, stepping carefully over the debris, it became clear that this wasn't a trick of my mind. This was real. She was tall, with dark hair pulled back in a braid that fell over her shoulder. Her clothes were covered in dirt and ash, but there was something calm and deliberate about the way she moved. She crouched beside me, her green eyes scanning my face with an intensity that made my chest tighten, not from the weight, but from something else I couldn't quite name. "You're not dead," she said, her voice steady but firm. "Not yet, anyway." I wanted to respond, but my throat felt like sandpaper, and all I could manage was a weak, raspy sound. She didn't seem to mind. Without waiting for a reply, she began to inspect the steel beam pinning me down, her hands moving quickly but carefully. "Can you move your legs?" she asked, glancing at me briefly. I tried, but nothing happened. "No," I croaked, my voice barely audible. She frowned, her lips pressing into a thin line. "All right, don't move. I'll get you out of here." I almost laughed, almost. Get me out of here? Did she not see the state I was in? Did she not realize how hopeless this situation was? But there was something in her voice, a quiet determination that made me hesitate. She didn't sound like someone who gave up easily. As she worked to shift the rubble, I couldn't help but stare at her. There was something almost otherworldly about her presence, like she didn't quite belong in this place of destruction and death. It wasn't just the way she moved or the calm confidence in her voice. It was the way she made me feel. For the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't feel completely alone. "Why are you doing this?" I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't look at me, her focus still on the steel beam. "Because you're still breathing," she said simply. "And as long as you're breathing, there's a chance." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. A chance. That's all. It was really a slim, fragile thread of hope. But for some reason, the way she said it made it feel real, tangible, like something worth holding on to. It took her what felt like an eternity to free me. Every movement sent sharp jolts of pain through my body, but I forced myself to stay conscious. By the time she finally pulled me out from under the rubble, my vision was swimming, and my head felt like it was filled with cotton. But I was alive. Somehow, against all odds, I was alive. "You're going to be okay," she said as she hoisted my arm over her shoulder, her strength surprising given her lean frame. "Just don't give up on me." As we stumbled toward the faint glow of dawn breaking through the wreckage, her words echoed in my mind. Don't give up on me. Maybe, just maybe, I didn't have to give up on myself either. I woke to the smell of damp wood and the faint metallic tang of blood. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was, the haze of exhaustion and pain clouding my thoughts. Then it hit me, the warehouse, the explosion, the stranger who had pulled me from the brink. My body ached in ways I didn't know it could, but I was alive, and that fact alone felt like a miracle. The room around me was small and sparsely furnished. A single cot, my current resting place, sat against one wall, while a rickety table and two mismatched chairs occupied the other side of the room. The only light came from a small kerosene lamp on the table, its flickering flame casting dancing shadows on the peeling walls. The cabin was quiet, save for the faint rustle of leaves outside and the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards. I shifted slightly, wincing as pain lanced through my side. The bandage the woman had wrapped around me was snug and well secured, but it did little to dull the throbbing ache beneath. I tilted my head, trying to get a better look at my surroundings. The woman was sitting by the table, her back to me, her posture tense. She was cleaning a knife, the rhythmic scrape of metal on stone oddly soothing. "You're awake," she said without turning around. Her voice startled me, and I coughed, my throat dry and scratchy. "Barely," I managed, my words hoarse. "Feels like I got hit by a truck." "Close enough," she replied, still focused on the knife. "You lost a lot of blood. If I hadn't found you when I did, you wouldn't have made it." I wasn't sure how to respond to that. Gratitude felt insufficient, and skepticism felt ungrateful. Instead, I asked, "How long was I out?" "Almost a full day," she said, finally setting the knife down and turning to face me. Her expression was calm, unreadable. "I patched you up as best I could, but you'll need time to heal. Don't try to move around too much." I nodded, the movement small and careful. "Thanks," I said, the word awkward on my tongue. It wasn't something I said often, or at all, really. But she didn't seem to mind the stiffness in my voice. She just nodded and went back to her work. The silence between us stretched, heavy but not uncomfortable. I watched her as she moved around the room, her actions purposeful and efficient. She checked the locks on the door and windows, adjusted the lamp, and then began sorting through a small stash of supplies on the table. It was clear she had done this before, whatever this was. "Do you live here?" I asked, my voice breaking the quiet. "Sometimes," she said without looking at me. "It's a safe house. One of many." "Safe from what?" She paused, her hand hovering over a tin of something I couldn't identify. "From people who want me dead," she said finally, her tone matter-of-fact. Her words sent a chill down my spine. I wasn't sure what I had expected her to say, but the bluntness of her response caught me off guard. "And those people, are they the same ones who blew up that warehouse?" I asked carefully. She didn't answer right away, her fingers idly tracing the edge of the tin. "Maybe," she said eventually. "Maybe not. It doesn't matter. What matters is that they didn't find you." The way she said it made it clear the conversation was over, at least for now. I let it drop, too tired to press further. Instead, I focused on the immediate discomfort in my body, the ache in my side, the stiffness in my limbs, the dryness in my mouth. "Got any water?" I asked. She nodded, grabbing a bottle from the table and bringing it over to me. "Drink slowly," she said, handing it to me. "You're dehydrated." I took a sip, the cool liquid a relief against my parched throat. "You're good at this," I said after a moment, gesturing vaguely at my bandages and the setup in the cabin. "The whole survival thing." Her lips twitched, almost like she was suppressing a smile. "You could say that. You military?" I asked, curiosity getting the better of me. "No." "Ex-military?" "No." "Okay, then what? You some kind of survivalist? A secret agent?" Her expression hardened slightly, and I immediately regretted pushing. "I'm just someone who knows how to stay alive," she said, her tone sharp. "That's all you need to know." I raised my hands in a gesture of surrender, wincing as the movement pulled at my wound. All right. No need to bite my head off." She sighed, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. "Sorry," she said almost reluctantly. "I'm not used to company." "No kidding," I muttered, earning a faint smirk from her. It was the closest thing to a smile I'd seen from her, and for some reason, it made me feel lighter. For the next few hours, we settled into an uneasy rhythm. She moved around the cabin, checking supplies and preparing a small meal, while I stayed put on the cot, trying to gather my strength. The pain in my side dulled slightly as the minutes ticked by, though it was still far from comfortable. Eventually, she brought over a bowl of something warm and handed it to me. "Eat," she said simply. I looked down at the contents, some kind of stew, thick and fragrant. It wasn't pretty, but it smelled good, and I realized how hungry I was. "Thanks," I said, taking a cautious bite. It was surprisingly good, and I found myself eating more quickly than I intended. As I ate, I couldn't help but study her. She was a mystery, this woman who had saved me. There was a hardness to her, a sharpness that suggested she'd seen more than her fair share of pain. But there was also a quiet kindness in the way she tended to me, a patience that didn't quite match the rest of her demeanor. "You never told me your name," I said, breaking the silence. She hesitated, her eyes meeting mine for a brief moment before looking away. "Kara," she said finally. "You." "Lucas," I replied. It felt strange saying my name out loud like it belonged to someone else. "Well, Lucas," she said, her tone softer than before. "Get some rest. You'll need your strength." I nodded, setting the empty bowl aside and leaning back against the cot. As I closed my eyes, I felt the weight of exhaustion pulling me under. But for the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't feel completely alone. Kara was a stranger, yes, but she was also my lifeline, the person who had dragged me from the edge of death and given me a chance to fight another day. And for now, that was enough. The days blurred together, each one a quiet fight for survival. I couldn't do much except lie on that cot and let time crawl by while Kara moved about the cabin, silent and focused. She checked the perimeter regularly, her footsteps light but deliberate, and her gaze constantly flicking toward the windows as if expecting something, or someone, to appear. My body healed slowly, each day marginally better than the last. The dull ache in my side turned into a sharp throb only when I moved too quickly, and my strength began to return in frustratingly small increments. Kara was the constant through it all, a steady presence that demanded no explanations and offered no unnecessary words. I hated being useless, lying there while she worked. The silence gave my thoughts too much room to wander, dragging me back into the places I had spent years trying to avoid. Regrets came creeping in like shadows. Mistakes I'd made, people I'd failed, and the life I'd ruined with every bad decision that had led me to that warehouse. But Kara didn't let me wallow. She didn't hover or coddle, but she didn't let me sink either. When the guilt and self-pity became too much to bear, her voice cut through the fog like a blade. "You've been through worse, haven't you?" she asked one evening, her tone casual but her gaze piercing. I blinked at her, unsure how to respond. "What makes you think that?" She shrugged, leaning against the table where she was cleaning her knife again. She seemed to have an endless supply of weapons, each one meticulously maintained. "The way you look when you're staring at the ceiling, like you're fighting something no one else can see." I swallowed hard, her words hitting closer to the truth than I wanted to admit. "I'm not fighting anything," I lied. "Just thinking, she repeated, her lips twitching as though she found the word amusing. "Sure, let's call it that." She didn't press further, but her words stayed with me long after the conversation ended. She was right. I was fighting something, but it wasn't just the physical pain or the immediate danger we were in. It was the ghosts of my past, the weight of choices I couldn't take back. And now, lying in a cabin with a stranger who had saved my life for reasons I didn't fully understand, those ghosts felt closer than ever. A week passed before Kara finally allowed me to get up and move around. My legs were shaky at first, and used as supporting my weight after days of stillness. She watched me carefully, her arms crossed over her chest as I shuffled awkwardly from the cot to the table and back again. "You're not going to heal if you keep lying there like a lump," she said bluntly one morning, tossing me a small stick she had carved into a crude walking cane. "Get moving. Your body needs it." I grumbled under my breath, but obeyed, forcing myself to take slow, measured steps around the room. The effort left me winded and sore, but it felt good to move, even if it was just a few feet at a time. "You're bossy," I muttered as I leaned against the cane, my breath coming in short gasps. Kara smirked, her first genuine smile since I'd met her. "And you're lazy. Looks like we're stuck with each other." Her words surprised a laugh out of me, the sound rough and unfamiliar. It had been so long since I'd felt anything resembling humor that it almost startled me. But the moment passed quickly, and my thoughts returned to the question that had been gnawing at me since she dragged me out of the warehouse. "Why do you care?" I asked, my tone softer than I intended. "Why did you save me?" Kara's expression shifted, the humor fading as quickly as it had come. She leaned back against the table, her arms crossed once more. "I told you, someone once saved me. Now I pay it forward." "That's not an answer," I pressed, ignoring the ache in my side. "You didn't know me. For all you knew, I could have been the one who caused that explosion. Why take the risk?" For a long moment, she didn't say anything. Her gaze drifted to the window, her green eyes distant. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than usual, almost hesitant. "I didn't always live like this," she said, gesturing vaguely around the cabin. "I had a life once, a family, people I cared about." She paused, her jaw tightening. "And I lost them, all of them, because I made a mistake, because I trusted the wrong person." Her words hung heavy in the air, and I didn't dare interrupt. She seemed far away, her gaze unfocused as though she was seeing something I couldn't. "After that, I ran," she continued, her tone hardening. "I ran for so long I forgot what it felt like to stop. And then, one day, someone found me, Someone who didn't know me anything, who didn't know me, but saved me anyway. They gave me a chance to fight back, to survive. She looked at me then, her eyes sharp and unflinching. That's why I saved you. Because sometimes, when you're at your lowest, all it takes is one person to remind you that you're not done yet. I swallowed the lump in my throat, her words cutting deeper than I expected. I wanted to say something, to thank her, to offer some kind of acknowledgement, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I nodded, hoping it was enough. That night, I couldn't sleep. Her story rattled around in my head, stirring up memories I'd tried to bury. I thought about my brother, the way his face had lit up every time he talked about his dreams. He had wanted to travel, to see the world and experience things most people only read about. And then, because of me, he never got the chance. I thought about the debts I'd racked up, the people I'd hurt along the way. I thought about the warehouse, the deal I had been trying to make when everything went wrong. And I thought about the explosion, the moment I thought I was going to die, and how, for a split second, I'd almost welcomed it. Almost. You're not done yet. Kara's words echoed in my mind, louder than the ghost that haunted me. I wasn't sure she was right, but for the first time in a long time, I wanted to believe she was. When morning came, I forced myself out of bed and began walking laps around the cabin, my movements slow but determined. Kara raised an eyebrow as she watched me, but she didn't say anything. Instead, she handed me a bowl of food and a nod of approval. The ghosts weren't gone. Not yet. But as I sat at the table with Kara, the sunlight streaming through the cracks in the boarded-up windows, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. The days continued to pass, one bleeding into the next, as I worked to regain my strength. The cabin had become a strange kind of sanctuary, a place where the outside world felt distant and muted. Kara was a steady presence, her quiet competence both reassuring and unnerving. She never pressed me for details about my past, never asked why I'd been in that warehouse or what I'd done to end up there. But her silence was heavy, as though she was waiting for me to offer something on my own. And maybe I would have eventually if the peace had lasted. It was a cool, quiet evening when everything changed. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the woods in a pale, silver glow. Kara and I had just finished a simple meal, canned beans and some kind of jerky she'd scrounged from her supplies, and she was sitting by the table, sharpening one of her many knives. I was at the window, leaning on the cane she'd given me, staring out at the darkened trees. The world outside was still, but there was an edge to the silence, a tension I couldn't quite name. "You feel that?" I asked, my voice low. Kara looked up, her eyes narrowing. "Feel what?" "I don't know." I hesitated, gripping the cane tighter. "Something's off." She didn't dismiss me. Instead, she stood, moving to the window and peering out into the darkness. Her body was tense, her movements careful and deliberate. For a long moment, neither of us spoke, the quiet between us broken only by the faint rustle of leaves outside. And then we heard it, a sound so faint I almost thought I'd imagined it. A crunch of gravel, a snap of a twig. Kara's hand went to the knife at her side, her body coiled like a spring. "Get down," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. I didn't argue. I lowered myself to the floor, wincing as the movement pulled at my still-healing wound. Kara moved to the door, her steps silent, her eyes scanning every shadow. The tension in the air was thick enough to choke on, and my pulse thundered in my ears as I waited, every muscle in my body screaming at me to do something, anything other than cower on the floor. Then came another sound, closer this time. Footsteps, deliberate and heavy, crunching against the gravel outside the cabin. Whoever was out there wasn't trying to be quiet anymore. Kara turned to me, her expression sharp and urgent. "Stay here," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. "If anything happens, you run. Understand?" I didn't have time to argue before she slipped out the door, her knife gleaming in the pale moonlight. The door closed softly behind her, and I was left alone, my heart pounding in my chest. I strained to hear what was happening outside, every nerve in my body on edge. The first shout came moments later, followed by the unmistakable sound of a struggle. My instinct screamed at me to stay put, to do as Kara had told me, and wait for her to handle it. But I couldn't. Not when the person who had saved my life was out there fighting alone. I forced myself to my feet, gripping the cane like a weapon, and limped toward the door. My side throbbed with every step, but I ignored it, adrenaline drowning out the pain. When I pushed the door open, the scene that greeted me was chaos. Kara was in the thick of it, her movements fluid and precise as she faced off against two men dressed in dark clothing. One of them had a gun, but she was too quick, darting out of his line of sight before he could fire. The other man had a knife, but he was clumsy compared to her, his attacks wild and desperate. I hesitated, my mind racing. I wasn't in any shape to fight, but I couldn't just stand there and watch. As Kara disarmed the man with the gun, twisting his wrist until he cried out in pain, I spotted movement in the trees behind her. Another figure, creeping through the shadows, a weapon glinting in his hand. "Kara!" I shouted, my voice hoarse. She didn't hesitate. Without looking, she ducked, narrowly avoiding the blow aimed at her head. The third man lunged, but she was ready, spinning and slashing with her knife in a single fluid motion. He stumbled back, clutching his arm, blood seeping through his fingers. It should have been over then, but it wasn't. The man with the gun, now disarmed but still dangerous, reached into his jacket and pulled out something small and black. A second gun. Kara was too far to stop him, and he was aiming straight at her. I didn't think. There wasn't time. I gripped the cane tighter and hurled it with all the strength I had left. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The cane struck his arm, throwing off his aim, and the shot went wide, the sound echoing through the trees like a thunderclap. Kara didn't waste the opportunity. She closed the distance between them in an instant, her knife flashing as she disarmed him for the second time. The fight ended quickly after that, the remaining men retreating into the woods, their shouts fading into the distance. When it was over, Kara turned to me, her expression unreadable. "I told you to stay inside," she said, her tone more exasperated than angry. I shrugged, leaning heavily against the doorframe. "Yeah, well, I'm not great at following orders," she sighed, shaking her head. "You could have gotten yourself killed, or I could have saved your life." I countered, a small smirk tugging at the corner of my mouth. "You're welcome, by the way." For a moment, I thought she might actually yell at me. But then, to my surprise, she laughed, a quiet, almost reluctant sound that softened the hard edges of her face. "You're impossible," she said, but there was no heat in her words. We didn't talk much as we cleaned up the mess, dragging the unconscious man who hadn't managed to escape into the cabin and tying him to one of the chairs. Kara worked quickly, her movements efficient and practiced, while I did my best to stay out of her way. When we were done, she turned to me, her expression serious. "They know where we are now," she said. "We can't stay here." I nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. The safe house had been a haven, a place where I could heal and begin to find my footing again. But it wasn't safe anymore. We had to move. As I sat back on the cot, exhaustion threatening to pull me under, one thought lingered in my mind. The world outside the cabin was dangerous, chaotic, and full of uncertainty. But for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was facing it alone. The hours after the fight passed in a haze of preparation. Kara was relentless, moving around the cabin like a soldier on a mission. Every action had purpose. Checking supplies, sharpening weapons, packing essentials. There was no hesitation, no wasted movements. It was clear she'd done this before. Me? I was a mess. My body ached from the effort of simply standing, and my mind was still spinning from what had just happened. The cane I'd thrown during the fight now leaned against the wall, forgotten for the moment, but the adrenaline that had driven me to act had long since worn off. What remained was a raw, bone-deep exhaustion. Still, I couldn't just sit there. Not anymore. Not after what I'd seen. What happens now? I asked, breaking the tense silence as I eased myself into one of the mismatched chairs near the table. My voice came out rough, strained. Kara didn't look up from where she was stuffing a bag with supplies. "Now we leave," she said simply. "We can't stay here. They'll be back, and next time, they won't come alone." Her words sent a chill down my spine. The men who had attacked us were ruthless, and it was clear they'd been hunting her, or maybe both of us now. The thought of facing more of them made my stomach churn, but I pushed the fear aside. "Where do we go?" Kara paused, her hands stilling for just a moment before resuming their task. "There's another safe house," she said. "Farther out. It's more remote, harder to find, and safer." I asked, my skepticism slipping through despite my best efforts. She gave me a look, one eyebrow raised. "Nothing's safe," she said bluntly. "But it's better than staying here and waiting to die." I couldn't argue with that. The cabin had been a temporary refuge, but it was never meant to be permanent. It was just a stopgap, a place to regroup and recover. Now that it was compromised, we had no choice but to move on. As Kara worked, I couldn't help but think about the fight. The way she had moved, so precise and controlled, like she'd been trained for moments like that. The way she'd faced down armed men without flinching, her focus unshakable. And then there was me, hobbling into the fray with nothing but a cane and sheer desperation. "You're good at this," I said, my tone laced with a mixture of admiration and curiosity. "The fighting, the planning, surviving. You make it look easy," she snorted, slinging the packed bag over her shoulder and turning to face me. "It's not easy," she said. "It never is. But you do what you have to." Her words hit harder than I expected, and I found myself nodding, even though I didn't fully understand what she meant. Yet, we left just before dawn, the first rays of sunlight barely cutting through the dense canopy of trees surrounding the cabin. Kara led the way, her movements sure and deliberate, while I followed a few steps behind, my steps slower and less confident. The bag she'd packed for me was light, but it still felt like a burden with every step I took. The woods were eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that made you feel like you were being watched. Every snap of a twig beneath my boots made me flinch, my eyes darting to the shadows, as if expecting another ambush. Kara didn't seem bothered. Her knife was in her hand, her posture alert but not tense. She was ready for anything, and somehow, that gave me a sliver of confidence. "Do you always live like this?" I asked after a while, my voice breaking the stillness. "Like what?" she asked without turning around. "Running, hiding, fighting." She was quiet for a moment, her steps never faltering. Then she said, "I don't live. I survive." Her words hung in the air between us, heavy and unyielding. I didn't know how to respond, so I didn't. Instead, I focused on keeping up, on putting one foot in front of the other despite the protest of my body. We walked for hours, the woods around us shifting from dense to sparse and back again. The terrain was uneven, and I stumbled more than once, but Kara never slowed. She kept her pace steady, her gaze fixed ahead, her expression unreadable. Eventually, the trees began to thin, giving way to a rocky outcropping that overlooked a narrow valley. Kara stopped, her eyes scanning the horizon as she motioned for me to join her. I leaned against a nearby tree, grateful for the brief reprieve, and followed her gaze. The view was breathtaking. The valley stretched out before us, a patchwork of trees and open fields bathed in the golden light of the rising sun. In the distance, a faint trail of smoke curled into the sky, barely visible against the morning light. "What's that?" I asked, nodding toward the smoke. "Another safe house," Kara said. "If we're lucky, it's still empty. And if we're not," she glanced at me, her expression calm but serious, "then we deal with it." Her confidence was both reassuring and terrifying. I wanted to believe she could handle whatever came our way, but a part of me couldn't shake the nagging doubt in the back of my mind. What if this time We didn't get lucky. What if the people hunting us were already there? Waiting? Kara didn't wait for me to dwell on it. She started down the trail that led into the valley, her steps sure and unhurried. I followed, my body protesting every movement, but my mind too restless to stop. The closer we got to the smoke, the heavier the weight in my chest grew. The safe house, if you could call it that, was a small, weathered cabin nestled at the edge of the tree line. It was even more run down than the last one, its roof sagging and its windows covered in grime. But it was quiet, and there was no sign of movement nearby. Kara approached cautiously, her knife at the ready, while I hung back, my cane in hand. She signaled for me to stay put as she moved toward the cabin, her movements slow and deliberate. I held my breath, every nerve in my body on edge. When she finally stepped inside and didn't immediately come back out, I forced myself to follow. The interior was as bare as the exterior suggested. Just a single room with a cot, a small stove, and a rickety table. Kara was already rummaging through a cabinet in the corner, checking for supplies. "It's clear," she said without looking up. "For now," I nodded, relief washing over me as I sank into the nearest chair. My body ached from the journey, but it was nothing compared to the exhaustion pressing down on my mind. For the first time since we'd left the other cabin, I felt like I could breathe. "We'll stay here for a few days," Kara said, setting down a can of something that looked vaguely edible. "Long enough to rest and figure out our next move." I looked at her, my chest tightening with a mix of gratitude and guilt. "Why do you keep doing this?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. "Helping me, dragging me along when I'm just slowing you down." Kara paused, her eyes meeting mine. For a moment, she didn't say anything, and I thought she might brush off the question like she always did. But then she said, "Because I've been where you are. I've been broken, lost, thinking there's no way out. Someone helped me once, and now it's my turn." Her words struck something deep inside me, something I hadn't let myself feel in years. Hope. It was fragile and fleeting, but it was there. And for the first time in a long time, I thought maybe, just maybe, I wasn't completely beyond saving. We settled into the cabin as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the valley in shadows. The world outside was still dangerous, and the people hunting us weren't far behind. But in that moment, sitting in the quiet with Kara, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Alive.